2,000 years ago, long before the world ever heard the word cartel, the land we now call Mexico was quite vast and full of contrast. Towering mountains, endless deserts, and deep valley that felt untouched by time. Small villages were scattered across this land where life moved slowly and simple, where people woke up with the sun, worked in the fields, and returned home before dark. Living on crops, they grew themselves and traditions that had been passed down for generations. And in those days, survival depended on the land, not on power, not on money, and definitely not on violence. And if you stood in one of those villages and looked around, you would never imagine that this same land would one day become the center of one of the most powerful and feared criminal networks in the world. Welcome to 369 Flop Shows. This is the first episode of our cartel series, and if you are interested in stories like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. In the early 1900s, Mexico was no longer peaceful because the country was shaken by the Mexican Revolution, a brutal and chaotic conflict that lasted for years, where different groups fought for power, land, and control. And while the revolution did bring change, it also left behind something dangerous: weak system, broken institutions, and a government that struggled to fully control its own territory, especially in rural and mountainous regions. And this weakness created gaps where law and order didn't exist strongly, gaps where people had to depend on themselves to survive. And in those gaps, new kind of activities began to grow quietly, away from the heights of authority. As the country tried to rebuild, many rural communities were left behind, with very few opportunities to grow economically, and farmers who once relied on traditional crops like corn or beans found themselves struggling to make enough money to survive, because the market was unstable and life was getting harder. And it was in this struggle that some farmers began to experiment with different kind of crops that didn't just feed people but could be sold for much higher prices, crops like marijuana and opium poppies. And at first, this wasn't about crime or power, it was about survival. It was about feeding families and finding a way out of poverty, and slowly these crops started becoming more common in certain regions, especially in isolated places where the government had little presence. At the same time, something important was happening just across the border in the United States, where cities were growing rapidly, and with that growth came new lifestyles, new cultures, and new demands. And among these demands was a growing interest in drugs and heroin. And this demand created a powerful connection between two very different worlds. On one side, poor farmers in Mexico trying to survive. On the other side, consumers in the United States willing to pay high prices. And this connection became the foundation of something much bigger, something that would slowly grow stronger over time. One such region was Sinaloa, a place that would later become one of the most important centers in the drug trade. But back then, it was simply a remote and rugged land filled with mountains that made it difficult to access and even harder to control. And these natural features made it a perfect place for activities that needed to stay hidden. Because when you live in a place where roads are few and authorities are far away, you can operate without being noticed. And for many people, this isolation became an advantage. In the beginning, the trade was small and unorganized, carried out by individuals or small groups who transported goods across the border quietly, often risking their lives. But as the demand increased, so did the need for more reliable and organized system. And people began to form networks, simple at first but effective, where one group would grow the crops, another would transport them, and another would sell them. And without realizing it, they were building the early structure of what would later become powerful criminal organizations. Even though at this stage there was very little violence involved, and most of it operated in the shadows unnoticed by the wider world. What made this system grow even faster was geography, because Mexico's location made it a perfect bridge between South America, where drugs like cocaine were produced, and the United States, where the demand was highest. And this strategic position turned Mexico into a key key route in the global drug trade. And as more routes were discovered and more people got involved, the scale of the operation began to increase slowly but steadily, like a fire that starts small but spread when the conditions are right. But even then, there was no massive cartels, no heavily armed groups, and no open battles with the military. Just people adapting to opportunities, finding ways to survive in a system that offered them very little. And while it may have seemed harmless or small at first, the truth is that the foundation of something much more powerful was being laid during this time. Because when money starts flowing and when systems starts forming, they don't stay small forever. They evolve, they expand, and they eventually demand control. And this is exactly what was beginning to happen. Because as the trade grew, so did the profits. And where there is money, there is always competition. And where there is competition, power becomes important. And slowly, the people involved in this trade began to realize that controlling routes, controlling supply, and controlling territory could give them an advantage. And this shift from simple trade to controlled operation was the first step towards something much bigger, something much more dangerous. Because Mexico was no longer just a place where drugs were grown or transported. It was slowly becoming a system, a network, a hidden world that was learning how to organize itself. And even though it was still in its early stages, the direction was clear, and the path ahead would lead to the rise of powerful groups that would change the country forever. Groups that would no longer operate quietly in the shadows, but would one day step into the light with power, influence, and fear. And as demand continued to rise, and as these small networks kept growing stronger, Mexico was unknowingly stepping into a new era, an era where the rules would be different, where survival would no longer be enough, and where power would become the ultimate goal. And in the next chapter of this story, these small scattered networks would come together to form something far more organized, far more dangerous, and far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you, and see you soon in my next video.